Imagine finding yourself in an old Victorian house, surrounded by its history, unaware of the secrets lurking behind its doors. This story is the real experience of a man named Daniel Carter. By the end of this video, you will be left thinking about the scary things happening in our world. Daniel Carter never believed in ghosts. He spent his time exploring forgotten buildings, capturing their decay through his camera lens. To him, abandoned places were just empty shells, nothing more. So, when he found a massive Victorian house for sale in a town no one seemed to care about, he saw nothing but potential. The price? Suspiciously low. The previous owners? Long gone. The reason? No one would say. From the outside, the house stood like a relic from another time. Ornate woodwork, a looming rooftop, and windows that seemed too dark even in daylight. The moment he stepped inside, the floor groaned under his weight, as if it hadn't held a person in ages. Dust filled the air, coating everything in a thick, undisturbed layer. But something about the house felt off. As he explored room by room, his excitement faded, not because of what he found, but because of what he didn't. One door, no handle, no key, just a gaping antique keyhole. At first, it was just a curiosity, a door locked for so long that the wood had fused with the frame. But as Daniel stood there, staring, he felt something deep in his gut, a quiet, crawling unease. He tried to ignore it, continuing to unpack, convincing himself it was just another quirky part of the house. That night, everything changed. It started with the whispers. Faint at first, a soft hum like the distant murmur of a conversation happening on the other side of the door. He paused, listening, telling himself it was the wind slipping through the old walls. But then came the scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the wood inside the locked room. Daniel grabbed his flashlight, heart hammering, and walked toward the door. His breath felt too loud, his own footsteps heavier than they should be. He placed a hand on the cold wooden surface, waiting. Silence. His mind raced. Maybe it was a rat. Maybe the house was just settling. He leaned in, pressing his ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement. Bang! The impact nearly threw him off his feet. The entire house shuddered, a deafening crash from behind the door, as if something massive had slammed into it with full force. Daniel stumbled backward, gasping. His flashlight flickered, his pulse pounded in his ears. Nothing moved. The house returned to its eerie stillness, as if it had been waiting for him to come closer, just to remind him he wasn't alone. Daniel stayed away from the door the next morning. He told himself it was just the house settling, maybe the wind forcing something to slam from inside, but deep down, he knew that sound wasn't random. Still, he tried to move on. He spent the day unpacking, ignoring the creeping thought that something wanted his attention. But as night fell, the feeling became unbearable. The door was waiting. By midnight, his curiosity won. He stepped toward it, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. He lowered himself to the keyhole. At first, darkness, then a faint crimson glow like a flickering candle somewhere deep inside. And then he saw her, a woman, standing in the center of the room, facing away. Still, too still. Daniel jerked back. His hands felt clammy, his stomach twisted into knots. Someone was inside that room. But that wasn't possible. The door had no handle, no key. It had been sealed for decades. His mind raced for an explanation. A trick of the light? A reflection? A leftover mannequin from whoever owned the house before? But as the night stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling. The next evening, he looked again. She had moved. Closer. She was still turned away, but this time, she was standing nearer to the door. Daniel's skin crawled. He grabbed his camera, switched it to record mode, and pointed the lens at the keyhole. If she was there, the camera would catch it. He stared through the lens, his hands trembling. He watched, recorded for minutes, then pulled away to check the footage. Nothing. Just a blank, dark space where the room should have been. Confused, he filmed again. This time he kept his eyes on the screen as he peeked through the keyhole. In the camera? Nothing. But with his own eyes, she was still there, still motionless, still watching the door, without facing it. Daniel's stomach lurched. He stopped the recording, scrolling through the footage frame by frame. For a long time the screen showed nothing but black. Then suddenly, an eye, wide, pale, pressed against the lens. Not his own, not human. Daniel threw the camera down. His breath came in quick, shaky gasps. His pulse pounded so hard he could hear it in his skull. He wanted to walk away, wanted to leave the house for good. But something pulled him back. That night, he checked the keyhole one more time. His flashlight flickered. His fingers tightened around it. Inside, bathed in the red glow, the woman turned. Fast, too fast. Daniel ripped himself away from the keyhole, stumbling back. He never saw her face, but she had seen his. And for the first time, he realized she knew he was watching. Daniel couldn't stay in that house another night. Not after what he saw. The woman, she moved. And even though he never saw her face, he knew. She saw his. He needed answers. The next morning, he drove into town, stopping at a small, dust-covered bookstore on the edge of the main road. The kind of place filled with old maps, forgotten history, and people who knew things others preferred to forget. Inside, he found an elderly man sitting behind the counter, flipping through a thick, worn book. The name Howard Ellison was stitched onto the front of his vest. Daniel cleared his throat. "That house up on the hill, do you know anything about it?" Howard's hands froze mid-turn. He didn't look up, didn't move. For a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, he closed the book. "That house," Howard muttered, voice low, almost cautious. "You mean the Hastings place?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, the one with the locked room." At that, Howard finally met his eyes. There was something there, a deep, knowing look, as if he already guessed why Daniel was asking. "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" Daniel's mouth went dry. He hadn't mentioned it, hadn't said a word about what he saw, but the way Howard spoke, it was like he already knew. "Who is she?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than before. "The woman inside." Howard let out a long breath. Then after a moment, he gestured toward a chair. "Sit down," he said. "You need to hear this." Daniel sat. Howard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, and began. "Eleanor Hastings lived in that house a long time ago. She was young, too young to understand the kind of town she was born into. She saw something she wasn't supposed to, something the town wanted buried. No one knows exactly what it was, a crime, a secret, something worse. But whatever it was bad enough that they locked her inside that room. They told the neighbors she had gone away, that she left town, vanished without a trace. But it wasn't true. She was still in that house, trapped. And when the years passed and no one heard from her, when the whispers started, when people swore they could hear her crying through the walls, the town made a choice. They sealed the door, bricked it up. They thought that if they buried the truth, it would stay buried. But Eleanor never left. She waited. And the only way she could ever be seen again was through that keyhole. Daniel's stomach turned, the room, the whispers, the way she kept moving closer, night after night. "She's still there," he muttered. Howard's expression darkened. "She's waiting," he said. Daniel felt something cold crawl over his skin. "Waiting for what?" Howard's eyes held his. "For someone else, to see what she saw." Daniel had two choices: leave the house forever or open that door. He knew what Howard told him. He knew the warnings, but something deep inside wouldn't let it go. That room had been locked for so long, sealed away, bricked up because the town was afraid of what Eleanor had seen. Daniel wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With shaking hands, he grabbed his tools and forced the lock. The old metal groaned under the pressure, the wood splitting slightly near the edges. Then a snap. The lock broke, The air changed instantly. The house went silent. Not the normal silence of an empty space. No, this was different. Thicker, heavier, like the entire house was holding its breath. Daniel pushed the door open. The room was empty. No furniture, no windows, nothing but bare, cracked walls and an old wooden floor coated in dust. And no woman, no glowing red light, no figure standing in the center, nothing. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It was just a story, just superstition. He had scared himself, convinced himself there was something when there wasn't. He turned to leave. The door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a violent, final thud that sent a shockwave through his chest. He spun around, grabbing at the handle, but there was nothing. No handle, no lock, nothing but a keyhole. But this time, it was on the inside. Daniel's body went cold. His breath came fast, ragged. His fingers trembled as he lowered himself to the floor, pressing his eye to the keyhole. Outside. She was standing there. Not inside the room anymore, outside the door, facing him. Her body twisted and wrong, bone sharp beneath her paper-thin skin, her mouth stretched open in a way that wasn't possible. And her eyes, she didn't have any, just dark, gaping holes where they should have been. Daniel jerked back, his pulse hammered, his skin burned with cold sweat. And then the house shook. The floorboards rattled beneath him. Objects from the other rooms crashed to the ground, smashing into pieces. A violent force ripped through the house, shaking the walls, slamming doors, sending dust spilling from the ceiling like falling ash. And then, the voice, right next to his ear. A breath too close, a sound too deep. You saw me. The walls split open, the air turned ice cold. Daniel screamed, but no one heard, because outside that room, the house was silent. The house came alive. The walls groaned, the air vibrated, and something deep beneath the floorboards moved, as if the house itself was breathing. Daniel stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. He reached for the door, clawing at the wood, but there was nothing to grab, no handle, no escape. The room shook violently. Furniture from the other rooms crashed to the ground. The glass from the windows burst, shards flying through the air like sharp, glittering teeth. The floor beneath him buckled, forcing him down to his knees. Then the whispering started. Not one voice, many, layered over each other, rising and falling, circling him like a swarm. Daniel's breath hitched, and then a voice right next to his ear. You saw me. The sound ripped through his skull. Not just heard, felt. His vision blurred, his head pounded. A force took hold of him, dragging him backward, deeper into the room. He screamed, but the door didn't move. The walls didn't shake. And outside the house, everything went silent. Days passed, maybe weeks. The townspeople didn't notice at first. No one ever went near that house anymore. But one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a few people gathered at the base of the hill. The front door was slightly open. The windows, now empty holes, just like before. One of the men, a local who remembered the last time someone moved in, stepped closer. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. They all knew. The house had swallowed another. But there was something different this time. A child, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the house. There's a keyhole, she whispered. And she was right. Where the door to that room once stood, there was a new keyhole, fresh, like it had always been there. The girl took a step forward. Her mother grabbed her wrist. Don't. But curiosity is dangerous. The girl leaned in. She placed her eye against the keyhole, and inside, Daniel was there, standing, frozen in place, his mouth stretched open in a silent, endless scream, his hands pressed against the inside of the door. And then the girl saw it. A single, unmoving eye on her side of the keyhole.